The storm came roaring from the northwest like a living, vengeful spirit, devouring the sky in gray fury as the Bitterroot Mountains braced for its wrath. The air was so cold it crackled against bare skin, turning every breath into a knife. Snow fell not in soft flakes but in shards of ice, swirling like ghostly dancers, erasing the world one layer at a time. The Grayson family cabin, once a warm sanctuary nestled in towering pines, looked fragile under the siege of the storm. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and fear. Sarah paced the wooden floorboards with Dakota's leash clenched tight in her trembling hand. Jake stood by the window, his reflection ghostly in the frostbitten glass, scanning the tree line for a shape he knew better than his own shadow. Their children huddled on the couch, Dakota's favorite blanket draped over them like a shield, their eyes darting between their parents and the door, every second stretching like hours. Outside, Dakota, the giant Alaskan Malamute, silver as the moon, eyes fierce with a wild light, stepped into the storm as though called by something older than memory. His massive paws pressed deep into the virgin snow, each step a vow to return. But as the blizzard roared, even his powerful form dissolved into the blinding white, leaving behind only silence. The snow thickened until it swallowed the world whole. Wind tore through the forest like a predator. An hour passed. Then 2, then 3. Sarah's hope frayed with every tick of the clock, her voice thinning to a whisper as she called his name into the swirling dark. The storm made a fortress of ice around them, no path out, no clue in. Fear settled into the cabin like a second winter, and the hearts of those waiting began to freeze with it. Between beasts and humans, a thread of faith weaves a miracle or a heartbreak. By nightfall, the Bitterroots transformed into a kingdom of absolute silence, broken only by the shrieking wind. The temperature plummeted, the mercury sinking below zero, the cold so deep it gnawed through layers of wool and down. Jake and Sarah took turns on the porch, bundled in parkas, faces raw and red, shining a flashlight into the white abyss, each beam a desperate prayer for the gleam of Dakota's eyes. Inside, the kids fell asleep in fits, clutching the blanket that smelled of their missing friend. The house felt alien without the soft thump of Dakota's paws, the way he'd nudge open doors or flop by the fire. It was as if a vital organ had been ripped from the home. The storm's rage quieted by dawn, but it left a landscape unrecognizable. Trees bowed under avalanches of snow, familiar paths erased, trail markers buried beneath drifts taller than a man. Jake rose before light. Pulling on his boots with mechanical resolve, he said nothing. He didn't have to. Sarah's eyes, swollen and red, mirrored his thoughts. Time was the enemy now. Dakota was out there alone, or worse. She stayed behind, scanning the forest line as tears crusted into icy pearls on her lashes. The kids refused breakfast, their gaze locked on the window, hoping for a miracle. As Jake trudged into the recarved wilderness, each step fell heavy with the weight of what he might find, or what he wouldn't. The forest has its own heartbeat, but sometimes it will lend it to those who dare to love. Word of Dakota's disappearance spread through the valley like fire. On the second day, neighbors arrived with snowshoes and thermoses, their dogs padding at their sides, eyes wary, ears flicking at every sound. Park rangers joined the search, their breath steaming in the frigid air as they strategized beneath bent pines. A rescue team deployed a drone, its infrared camera sweeping the forest in skeletal red. Maps were unfolded on the Graysons' kitchen table. Dakota's photo, big, silver, noble, passed from hand to hand. Voices repeated his name like a chant against the indifferent woods. But the snow devoured every sound, every footstep. Time stretched into something cruel. Each hour without Dakota twisted deeper into dread. Sarah's calls turned hoarse and raw, her voice shivering in the trees. Jake pushed deeper into the forest, fighting snowdrifts up to his knees, each breath. Ragged clouds. The forest he knew, the trail markers, the curves of old pines, had become a maze of white, a shifting puzzle without edges. Every gust of wind erased his tracks as if the storm itself conspired to keep Dakota hidden. The volunteers' whistles faded in and out like ghosts calling to each other in a lost world. Somewhere out there, the dog who had been their rock was either fighting to get home or lying still under the endless white. Every living soul carries a light, and when one flickers, others gather to shield it. On the third day, fatigue and despair began to weigh heavier than the snow. Sarah moved like a sleepwalker, her boots never leaving her feet, her hands numb as they clutched Dakota's worn leather collar. Jake's face grew hollow, a scruff of beard darkening his chin as he refused to come inside. The kids stopped asking when and simply stared at the door. The forest, once a place of laughter and family hikes, now loomed like a cruel deity. On the second ridge, Cassie, a volunteer's bloodhound, froze mid-stride, nose flaring. Her sudden pull drew everyone's breath. They scrambled after her to a brittle snow crust along the old creek bed. There, half-hidden, fragile as glass, lay a single paw print, massive, alone, edges curling where it had begun to melt and refreeze. A few feet away, a spruce branch hung broken, silver fur tangled in its bark. The clearing fell deathly quiet. Jake dropped to his knees, his gloved fingers brushing snow from the paw print, his breath coming in short, foggy gasps. Sarah crashed beside him moments later, her eyes wide with terror and a desperate spark of hope. "Is it him?" she rasped, voice cracking. Jake didn't answer. He couldn't, because the forest had spoken, but in riddles, offering only a shard of a clue and no peace. Around them, the trees stood sentinel, silent witnesses to a family's unraveling. As the sun began its slow, cruel descent, the cold gathered again, sharper than before, each gust whispering the same haunting question: how many more nights could Dakota survive, and how many more could they endure without him? In the wild, hope is a fragile ember, but even a single spark can light the way home. On the fifth morning, the Grayson home felt like a tomb. The coffee pot sat cold on the counter. No one had touched it. Every tick of the old clock rang like a hammer blow in the silent kitchen. The children sat bundled on the couch, Dakota's blanket pulled to their chins, eyes fixed on the door with a quiet, searing desperation. Outside, the forest gleamed under a sunless sky, the snow glistening like a death shroud. Sarah slumped in the doorway, boots caked in ice, hair matted from sleepless nights. She hadn't changed clothes in days. Her eyes were dull, as if part of her had frozen solid. Jake stood beside her, scanning the horizon with binoculars, each sweep slower than the last. The volunteers had thinned, their voices softer, their pace slower. Even the dogs' tails drooped lower, their noses lifting less often. The cabin, once alive with Dakota's playful leaps and thunderous pawbeats, felt hollow, a shell echoing with memories. Every breath of wind that rattled the windows made the family flinch, straining to hear a bark, a howl, any sign that the soul of their home was still out there, fighting to come back. But the blizzard had taken more than visibility. It had stolen time, hope, and the fragile threads of faith binding them together. And so the Graysons waited, each hour a question they could not answer, each dawn colder than the last, praying that somewhere in the wilderness their fierce, loyal friend was still alive and still trying to find his way back to the light. They kept burning just for him. She paced like a restless ghost between the frostbitten windows, each gust of wind sending a shiver through her spine and a twitch to her fingertips. Every time the snow shifted, she froze, breath caught in her chest, eyes flicking to the tree line as though a shadow might step out. Her phone buzzed nonstop, neighbors offering worried words, volunteers checking in with apologies, park officials giving updates that were never updates. No news, still searching, still nothing. The silence between calls felt louder than any scream. Jake was a phantom of himself, dressing without a word, his boots laced with hands that trembled so hard he could barely grip the zipper on his coat. He slung the old shovel across his back, like a soldier's rifle, eyes fixed on the storm outside. He didn't say goodbye. He just vanished into the white the way Dakota had, swallowed by a storm that looked more alive than the forest it devoured. Above him, the sky hung flat and empty, a pale sheet stretched over a land of bent, frozen trees. Every branch reached down like a skeletal hand, clawing at the drifting snow. The path to the north ridge was obliterated by a drift that rose like a wall, chest high and menacing. Jake fought it for 3 hours, each shovel of snow a battle, each breath a ragged knife in his throat. He cleared just enough to slip through, refusing food or water, pausing only to listen, but the forest offered him nothing but the hiss of the wind. Every heartbeat in the wild is an echo of our own, a test of whether we can still hear it. By noon, 2 volunteers from Missoula joined him, one a wilderness tracker with eyes like cracked granite, the other a medic burdened with snowshoes, ropes, and an emergency kit. They arrived silent but determined, bringing a thermal drone as a final hope. Jake hovered over the small screen in their van, breath fogging the glass, eyes locked on shifting black and white images of an endless skeletal forest. The drone flew grid after grid over valleys, ridges, frozen rivers, but the camera found only cold emptiness. No heat, no life. Just the relentless sprawl of a forest that had devoured the only thing that mattered. The dogs that joined the search fell quiet, their tails low, their noses twitching hesitantly at the snow that refused to tell its secrets. By dusk, even their eager whines died away, replaced by an oppressive silence that seeped into everyone's bones. That night, Sarah lit a single candle in the front window. Its weak flame danced behind the frost-crusted glass, a beacon that looked impossibly small against the storm. She set Dakota's metal bowl beside it, filled to the brim with fresh food. Not because she truly expected to see him come loping up the path, but because if he did, he shouldn't arrive hungry, just in case. When Jake stumbled home after midnight, ice clung to his beard, his lips blue, boots so frozen they clunked against the floor. He paused in the doorway like a statue, face hollow. Sarah ran to him, arms wrapping around his icy coat, face buried in the cold fabric. Neither spoke, neither cried. They just held each other, 2 souls frozen by grief, as silent as the world outside. Hope is a fragile fire in the snow. It needs hands willing to bleed to keep it alive. At 2 a.m., their daughter padded downstairs, a pale wisp in the gloom. She held Dakota's frayed rope toy in both hands, eyes wide and shimmering. Without a word, she stepped onto the porch, her tiny feet crunching the snow. She set the toy down carefully, like an offering to some ancient god of the storm. "I don't want him to be alone," she whispered to the dark. No one in the house slept that night. By day 6, despair had crept into every room like black mold. The local sheriff, hat clutched awkwardly in gloved hands, stood on their porch in the morning gloom, his words hesitant. "We've covered 30 miles, he said softly. "It's hard to imagine." His voice trailed off, heavy with what he couldn't say. Sarah thanked him politely, lips white, eyes hollow, then closed the door on him with a quiet finality. Outside, snow fell in steady curtains, erasing the world 1 inch at a time. Inside, time limped on, each tick of the clock a hammer blow to hope. Beyond the ridges, beneath the unyielding clouds, the forest clutched its secret tight. What kept Dakota away, and whether he still fought to come home? Miracles come quietly, like the first breath after drowning, unexpected, life-shattering. On the 11th morning, the sky cleared overnight, revealing a brutal, brilliant blue that glared cold light onto a world frozen into diamond-sharp silence. Trees stood stiff and unbowed, glittering with ice. The mountains loomed like frozen titans. The forest looked carved from glass, dangerous in its beauty. Jake didn't leave the house. He simply sat in a wooden chair by the window, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the tree line. Sarah stood behind him, arms hugging her ribs, both of them statues waiting for something neither dared to name. No calls came, no volunteers arrived. Flyers pinned to telephone poles lay still, paper curled and frozen to wood like old, brittle skin. Then at 9:12 a.m., something moved. Barely a flicker, like a trick of light. Jake lurched forward, breath stuck in his throat. The shape staggered, slow, limping, emerging from the shadows beneath the pines. "Sarah," he rasped, voice cracking. But Sarah was already moving, door flung open, boots thundering onto the porch, children screaming behind her. And there he was, Dakota, dragging himself across the snow. His once mighty body was rail-thin, silver fur caked with ice, one paw lifted gingerly, trembling. His head hung low, but his eyes, oh, his eyes still burned with life. He collapsed at the foot of the porch, chest heaving, legs folding. Sarah dropped to her knees, scooping his massive head into her lap, sobbing as her tears melted against his frozen fur. Jake knelt beside them, hands shaking as he touched Dakota's neck, whispering words he couldn't finish. The children fell around him, hands clutching his fur. Voices tangled in laughter and sobs, but none of them noticed the second shadow until it was nearly at their feet. Sometimes the wild brings back not just the lost, but something that needed to be found. A tiny round shape appeared beside Dakota's flank, a scrap of fur and bones with impossibly large paws and eyes. The color of molten gold, a baby? Bobcat, no more than 4 weeks old, frost clinging to his whiskers, ribs sharp under patchy fur. He moved quietly, without fear, pressing himself against Dakota's side like he had been born there. Dakota shifted, paw curling protectively around the kitten's fragile body, pulling him close. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "Oh God," she gasped, hands flying to her mouth. The kitten blinked up at her, calm, unafraid, breath slow but steady. When Dakota lifted his head weakly, the little bobcat nuzzled under his chin, eyes fluttering closed in utter trust. Jake's voice broke as he whispered, "He didn't just come home. He brought him back." The children stared, wonder filling their tear-streaked faces. "Is that a baby wildcat?" one asked, voice trembling. Sarah shook her head, tears spilling again. "No," she choked out, "that's a bobcat. And he thinks Dakota is his mother." Inside, warmth bloomed as blankets, towels, and hot water surrounded the returning heroes. Dakota shivered by the fire as they cleaned his wounds, but the bobcat refused to leave his side, crawling over hands and vet's tools, purring like a kitten who had never known fear. Sarah watched them curled together, one giant dog broken by the storm, one tiny wild orphan tucked into his side, both breathing the same ragged breaths. And one question sang louder than the ticking clock. Where had they been all this time? And how, in a world of blizzards and hunger, had they found each other? Dakota's massive chest rose and fell in slow, ragged waves, each breath drawing the tiny body of the bobcat kitten up and down as if they were connected by an invisible thread of life itself. His ribs shifted gently, and Briar, they had named him that morning, after the thorny brambles he must have crawled through, nestled closer with every exhale, the kitten's fragile form almost disappearing into the thick silver fur of the old Malamute. At first, the vet balked, eyes wary, voice measured. "We don't touch wild cats," he said, scanning Briar with clinical detachment. "They can carry disease, they can bite, they belong in the wild." But when they tried to lift Briar, the kitten didn't hiss, didn't scratch. He screamed, a thin, desperate wail that shattered the quiet. He scrambled, claws flailing, not in aggression but terror, fighting with every ounce of his frail body to return to Dakota's warmth. His tiny limbs flung wide, latching onto Dakota's fur with a ferocity that made Sarah's heart clench. She didn't need science to explain what was plain in his enormous amber eyes. Briar didn't know he was wild, didn't know he was supposed to be alone. All he knew was Dakota. And Dakota, though gaunt, limping, and shivering with fever, shifted, his body instinctively to shield the kitten, curling protectively around him as though he'd been born to that role. The universe doesn't always choose families. Sometimes families choose each other. The vet finally relented, his voice softer as he examined the tiny creature. Briar was barely 4 weeks old, far too young to regulate his body. Temperature far too small to survive even a few hours without constant warmth. His body weight was dangerously low, and the cracked pads of his paws told a story of a journey that should have killed him. One more night in the storm, the vet said quietly, might have ended him, 1 more hour even. But Dakota, starving, wounded, limping, had kept Briar alive. The realization fell over the room like holy silence. The paw print they had found days earlier, pressed into the ice 5 miles from the Grayson cabin, meant Dakota had carried Briar across frozen valleys, up ridges treacherous with black ice, over rocks and drifts taller than the dog himself, all while bleeding and hungry, driven by something deeper than instinct. Jake sat on the floor beside them, speechless, one hand resting lightly on Dakota's head. Dakota's eyes opened every few minutes, scanning the room with weary urgency, searching not for threat, but for Briar. He would not rest until he felt the kitten tucked against him. Sarah watched with tears slipping down her cheeks as Briar suckled softly at the thick fur near Dakota's chest. Not for nourishment, there was none, but for comfort, for the memory of safety. It looked like a cub with its mother, like something eternal and wild and heartbreakingly innocent. Love is an ancient language, older than fear, older even than survival. As night fell, they built a bed by the fire. Dakota sprawled across a folded comforter, breath rattling in the stillness, legs stretched awkwardly. Briar curled tight into the hollow between his massive forelegs, one delicate paw resting on Dakota's ribs. In the hush of the dark, the kitten didn't cry, didn't stir, didn't flinch, even when the logs cracked sharply in the fireplace, even when the old clock ticked like a distant drum. Jake and Sarah sat vigil nearby, sleepless, eyes fixed on the pair. Every few hours, Dakota would groan softly, shifting from pain, but Briar always moved instantly with him, his tiny form magnetized to the dog's side. In those hours of transformation, unfolded silently, what had begun as a desperate search became something sacred, something beyond a simple animal rescue. It wasn't just survival. It was proof of a truth often forgotten, that the wild can love as fiercely, as selflessly, as any human heart. When Sarah finally whispered to the quiet room, "He thinks Dakota is his mother," no one corrected her because no one could deny what they were witnessing. Outside, the storm raged anew, snow lashing against the dark windows. Inside, a bobcat and a broken old dog slept pressed together, breathing in a single rhythm that defied the rules of nature itself. Some stories don't need words. They're written in the spaces between heartbeats. By the second morning, the bond was no longer just a miracle, it was immutable. Briar shadowed Dakota with relentless devotion, never more than a breath away. When Dakota shifted, Briar shifted. When Dakota drank, Briar watched, then crawled forward to lap the water beside him, his small tongue dipping awkwardly into the bowl as though trying to learn the ways of the world from the only teacher he trusted. Once, when Sarah tried to gently lift Briar so she could clean and bandage Dakota's cracked paw pads, the kitten's cry split the quiet, a raw, panicked sound that sent chills down her spine. His claws scrabbled frantically across the blankets, until he planted himself back against Dakota's chest, heart pounding wildly. He chose Dakota, Dakota chose him back. Each time the Malamute shifted his massive head, it was to nuzzle the kitten closer, to wrap him in a warm sigh so heavy with relief it seemed to vibrate through the room, but peace was a fragile gift. Even love must face the cold edge of the world, but sometimes it's worth the fight. The knock at the door landed like thunder. Jake froze, heart climbing into his throat. Outside, a white SUV idled on the icy road. A figure stepped out, bundled in an insulated green jacket, clipboard clutched like a shield. Their words were calm, their tone professional but edged with regret. "We've received a report of a wild bobcat being kept in a private residence," they said, eyes flicking to the fireplace where Briar lay, one tiny paw still draped possessively over Dakota's leg. "We understand the circumstances are unusual, but we're required to follow protocol." They explained the policy in careful words. Wild animals, even orphaned ones, cannot remain in homes. Human contact must be minimized for the animals. Proper development and future release. Safety. But safety didn't mean together. Safety meant alone. Before the words could sink fully into the room, Briar's ears twitched. The stranger's voice pulled him from sleep. His eyes blinked open. Unfocused, but found the unfamiliar figure, he didn't hiss. He didn't run. He simply crawled deeper into Dakota's side, pressing his face into the old dog's thick fur. The official stepped forward, voice softer but unwavering. "We're not here to take him immediately," they continued. "You have 72 hours to prepare. A team will arrive to transfer the bobcat to a licensed wildlife rehabilitation center. Sarah stepped between them and the fire without hesitation, her hands trembling even as she kept her voice level. "He's not just a wild animal," she said, her voice cracking on the word animal. "He's a baby. And he thinks Dakota is his family." Jake stepped up beside her, eyes shining with the weight of everything they'd endured. "They've been through something we can't even begin to understand," he added hoarsely. "If you separate them now, he won't survive it. Neither of them will understand." And in the hush that followed, as snow fell in drifting silence outside, the bobcat and the dog breathed together. Unaware that their time might already be slipping away, the visitor didn't argue, didn't threaten, didn't need to. They simply handed over a slip of paper stamped with a date and time, 72 hours. That's all the Graysons had left before the state would come back to take Briar away. When the door clicked shut behind them, the silence that settled over the cabin wasn't the heavy, suffocating hush of grief they'd grown used to. It was sharper, thinner, every second ticking like a blade sliding closer. The countdown had begun. Dakota dozed fitfully by the fire, breath rattling in his chest. Briar slept curled into the curve of his ribs, tiny paw rising and falling with the dog's labored breaths. The kitten didn't know his hours were numbered, but Sarah and Jake did. And now they stood on a precipice, surrender quietly or fight for something the world might never understand. Sometimes love demands we break the silence or risk losing everything it holds. Sarah never slept that night. She sat hunched at the kitchen table, face washed pale in the glow of her laptop screen, eyes flicking wildly as she searched page after page, state wildlife statutes, rehabilitation loopholes, custody exemptions. Every link led to the same cold conclusion. Wild animals, no matter how small, no matter how bonded, could not remain in a private home. But then, buried in bureaucratic jargon, she found a sliver of hope, a clause tucked inside the state's rehabilitation policy, allowing temporary, species-specific foster care under the supervision of a licensed nonprofit. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was something. By sunrise, she'd sent 7 desperate emails, left 5 voicemails. By noon, she'd launched a petition. Let him stay. Don't separate a bobcat from the only family he knows. It spread like wildfire. Neighbors signed. Volunteers who had searched for Dakota added their names. A woman from Darby, who'd lost a fawn under the same law, called to offer support. And then someone posted a video, just 30 seconds long, showing Briar, barely bigger than a rabbit, climbing onto Dakota's back on shaking paws. Dakota lay still, head heavy on his forelegs. The kitten reached his shoulder, curled his body around the dog's thick neck, and laid a paw over Dakota's muzzle like he was hugging him. By nightfall, it had 60,000 views. Strangers around the world left messages. This isn't just survival. This is love. They need each other. Don't take that baby from his mother. Sarah read each comment with tears streaking her cheeks, clutching her phone like a lifeline. Some stories speak in a language deeper than words, and when they do, the world listens. The veterinarian returned that afternoon, a wary look in his eyes. When he approached Dakota's side, Briar let out a low growl, so small, so fierce, it froze the vet in place. "He's guarding him," the vet whispered, stunned. Minutes later, he handed Sarah a printed report. His professional conclusion was unambiguous: forced separation at this stage, given the kitten's dependency, inability to self-feed, and persistent trauma, could result in extreme physiological distress and potential fatality. Jake read the words twice, then looked up, voice raw. "He's not ready to leave," he said hoarsely. Sarah pressed a shaking hand to Briar's small back. "He doesn't even know he's not supposed to be here." That night, the family filmed another clip, no narration, no music. Just Dakota and Briar asleep together by the fire, the bobcat's tiny paw resting protectively on the dog's nose. The video went viral overnight, minus 200,000 views by dawn. But the clock didn't stop ticking. The official notice, taped to the fridge, loomed over them. Transfer in 48 hours. Sarah's eyes lingered on the black letters. Could a rulebook feel the weight of a heartbeat pressed against another? Could bureaucracy understand what it meant to belong? Some battles begin long before you pick up a sword. They begin the moment you refuse to surrender. The letter arrived in a plain white envelope the next morning, its government seal cold as the snow outside. Sarah opened it with trembling hands. The words were brutal in their simplicity. The Bobcat must be surrendered within 24 hours. No exceptions. No appeals. She read it twice, tears clouding her eyes, then placed it on the table and stepped outside into the biting cold. Jake found her 20 minutes later, kneeling behind the woodshed, cradling Briar in her arms. The kitten slept with his head tucked beneath her chin as she whispered soft, desperate words, promises of safety, pleas to stay strong. When Jake crouched beside her, she looked up, eyes hollow. "We can't let them take him," she said, voice quiet and empty of hope. Jake swallowed hard. "I know," he said gently. "But we can't break the law either." They sat in silence. The forest looming around them, ancient trees standing sentinel and indifferent. There were caves in those woods, old cabins no one used. "If we left him deep enough," Sarah whispered, voice cracking, "they'd never find him." Jake's breath shivered in the air. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The thought had already crossed his mind. But before they could decide, the phone rang. Sarah nearly dropped it when she saw the unknown number. Her voice shook as she answered. On the other end came a calm, steady voice. "My name is Elena. I work with the Northern Wildlife Alliance. We saw the video, and we believe this case is different." Elena's voice cut through the fog of fear like a lantern in the dark. "We're a licensed nonprofit," she continued. "We operate under special rehabilitation provisions. If the state agrees to transfer temporary guardianship to us, we can provide sanctuary and keep the animals together." Sarah's breath caught. "You can keep them together?" she whispered. "Yes," Elena said firmly. "But we'll need to act fast. There's paperwork, legal language. The clock is already running. And you must understand, to do this, you'll have to surrender all custody. Dakota, too, for now." Inside, Dakota lay on the rug, his eyes heavy but never closing fully. Briar slept curled into his ribs, one small paw rising and falling with each weary breath. Could they survive another separation? Could they risk losing each other again? Jake stared at the floor, knuckles white on the kitchen table. Elena's voice came through the speaker, unwavering. "We can save them both, but we need to move now." It was a chance, slim, fragile, but real. And outside, the sound of tires crunching over ice shattered the dawn quiet. A white transport truck rolled up the driveway, state seal emblazoned on its side. Two officers stepped out, faces grim beneath winter hats. They carried a crate. Clipboard. The future Sarah stepped onto the porch, Briar clutched tight to her chest. The kitten squirmed, ears flattening as he sensed something terribly wrong. Inside, Dakota whined low and urgent. The second he heard the officer's boots crunch on the icy steps, Briar let out a piercing cry, wriggling free to leap to the floor and scramble to Dakota's side. He climbed the dog's back, tiny claws hooking into matted fur, his body pressed tight. His cries rose, sharp and desperate, echoing off the cabin walls. Dakota lifted his head, eyes locking with Sarah's eyes that pleaded, eyes that knew. Sometimes the wild teaches us what family means, and sometimes it demands we fight to keep it. The officers stepped forward. Sarah's voice cracked as she stepped between them and the animals. "Please," she begged, tears streaming, "just one more day." But they shook their heads, voices soft but final. "We're sorry. We have to proceed." Then a second vehicle appeared at the curve of the snowy road, smaller, unmarked, its tires skidding slightly as it pulled to a stop. A woman stepped out, her green parka bright against the gray morning. She held a manila envelope, high, striding forward with purpose. It was Elena Dot, and in that moment, a moment as thin and breakable as the ice beneath their feet. Hope stepped onto the porch. Elena walked quickly past the officers, her boots crunching across the snow, eyes locked on Sarah's. She nodded. Once, a silent vow, before turning to face the state representatives. Her voice rang clear in the frozen morning. I have a signed emergency order from the District Wildlife Court. Verified. Stamped, effective immediately. She held up the manila envelope like a torch in the dark. The officers took the document. Read it once, then again, the lines in their faces softening as they understood. The paper authorized temporary joint placement, licensed sanctuary custody, supervised care. The bobcat and the dog would remain together, transported together, monitored together. No cuffs. No cold crate? Just a warm van parked in the drive, its interior lined with soft mats placed side by side. Jake carried Dakota, cradling the dog's massive frame with gentle arms. Elena lifted Briar. The kitten instantly twisted in her grip, small claws reaching desperately for Dakota. Inside the van, they curled into one another like puzzle pieces, no fear left, just the steady rise and fall of shared breathing. Sarah stood in the snow, tears cutting warm tracks down her cheeks, her heart finally steady for the first time. In days, they were leaving together, not torn apart by cold laws or colder hearts. As the van pulled away, tires leaving twin grooves in the drifting snow, she whispered the words that had carried her through every hopeless night. Sometimes compassion is stronger than the law. The forest may hold its storms, but compassion holds the power to part them. The sanctuary was deep in the woods, tucked where the pines grew thick and the world softened to a quiet hum. Snow still blanketed the ground, but spring was threading warmth into the frozen earth, coaxing ice to water, brittle bark to buds. Dakota lay in a heated enclosure, body wrapped in fresh blankets, wounds healing with each passing day. He'd lost weight, but not the fire in his eyes. Every time the door creaked open, his ears lifted, searching. When Sarah arrived with the children bundled in coats, Dakota's tail thumped, weak at first, then stronger, a silent drumbeat of joy. He didn't try to stand. He didn't need to. Briar was already racing across the room, paws oversized and clumsy, launching himself into Dakota's blankets. Purring deep and low, for the first 2 weeks, the Graysons came every day. They weren't allowed into the enclosure, but they watched from behind the barrier as Briar learned to climb logs, to swat snowflakes drifting from the rafters, to eat solid food with awkward enthusiasm. He grew stronger, his coat thickening, his eyes turning from dull frost to sharp amber flame, but every nap, every strange noise, every sudden gust of wind still sent him scurrying back to Dakota's side. The sanctuary staff were patient and kind. They recorded every milestone. Briar's first meal without assistance, his first solo climb, the day he stopped trembling at thunder. Slowly, the kitten's dependency began to wane. Some bonds are born of desperation, others grow roots in love deeper than blood. By 8 weeks, Briar could feed himself confidently. At 9, he began sleeping in a separate enclosure, still within sight of Dakota, but alone. At 10, he no longer cried when apart, he was adapting. Dakota, watching from across the corridor, seemed to understand, his eyes followed every kitten step, but he no longer whined when Briar padded back to his own bed. On the 11th visit, the sanctuary director pulled Sarah aside. "He's ready," she said softly, "and so is Dakota." The paperwork was signed, hands shaken, tears shed. Dakota's guardianship returned to the Graysons, and when Jake stepped into the enclosure, Dakota stood on his own. Limping, yes, but proud, tail held high. Briar watched from a raised platform, golden eyes unblinking as Dakota walked away. He didn't chase. He didn't cry. But his ears swiveled to follow every step until the car door closed. Some goodbyes are really beginnings disguised as endings. Back home, Dakota moved through the house like a soldier returning from war, sniffing familiar corners, relearning the worn grooves of the hardwood floors. The children cheered, wrapping their arms around his thick neck. Sarah wept openly, pressing her face into his fur. Jake built a new bed by the fire, a fortress of blankets and memory. But every Sunday they made the drive back to the sanctuary. They didn't need to be told it was right. They just knew. Briar would sit by the gate before they arrived, ears pricked, tail twitching. The second Dakota stepped from the car, the bobcat would launch himself forward, not like a wild predator, but like a child running to his father. They would tumble together in the grass, Dakota rolling onto his back to let Briar crawl over him. Briar no longer needed Dakota to survive, but he still loved him. And Dakota, free of the burden of rescue, simply loved him back. Week after week, they greeted each other with silent joy, a bond forged in a blizzard and tempered by hope. Some stories don't end when the credits roll. They live on in every heartbeat that remembers. Briar grew into a powerful young bobcat, paws fast, body lean, eyes bright with the wild. He scaled trees in seconds, stalked birds with a grace that belonged to the forest. But every Sunday, when the Graysons' car rolled up the sanctuary road, he paused, listening for the engine's rumble. Dakota always stepped out first, slower now, but still steady, and Briar met him like clockwork. They walked the outer paddock together, side by side, no leash, no fear, no fences between them. Sarah and the children sat quietly on a bench nearby, watching the dance of two souls who had once saved each other. They didn't speak. They didn't need to dot at hope and first sanctuary. Every story becomes a voice, and every voice becomes hope. This journey from blizzard to belonging reminds us how compassion, not coincidence, changes lives for animals and the humans who love them. By watching, sharing, and supporting these stories, you help more creatures like Briar and Dakota find the safety, care, and second chances they deserve, because some bonds are stronger than fear, some families are formed beyond blood, and some stories like theirs remind us we are never truly alone.